Chapter 3 The Wilderness. M'dongo gave Nima's rear end a solid shove, sending her scurrying into the tall grass. Halima hesitated, then followed her, and M'dongo, knife in hand, disappeared last into the bush. Halima, her servant, and her loyal bodyguard ran through the tall grass, crouching, hotly pursued by the whooping warriors of the Zimbai. Halima glanced over her shoulder and saw a dozen of the painted men wading toward them through the crackling grass. She almost shrieked in terror, but choked back her cry. "Let's give ourselves up," Nima gasped, tears and sweat spewing from her in all directions. "Hush," whispered M'dongo, and wrenched both girls down to the ground. They nestled together, hidden from sight, as the warriors slowly converged on them, poking through the grass and mumbling to one another. Halima knelt, head bowed, like a rabbit hiding from some foraging beasts of prey. She bit back a hysterical laugh. "This is so strange," she thought. "I feel like we're playing our childhood game of hide and seek." Beside her, Nima clutched her robe and pointed with a trembling hand at the foot of a Zimbai warrior tiptoeing only a yard or so away. There came a low honk nearby. A moment later, the strange bellow sounded again. Halima had heard such a sound once before, but couldn't place it. There was a second of silence, then, "Snake! Snake!" a panicked voice squeaked in the tongue of the Zimbai. A terrible ruckus broke loose in the bushes as the startled warriors backed off, tumbling over each other, slashing at the grass willy-nilly with their spears, like old women chasing after a rat with their brooms. Halima was gripped by a primordial terror. She had always hated snakes, and now one must be just inches away. Again she had to fight the impulse to scream. The Zimbai were spitting distance away. "Nima fears snakes 10 times as much as I do," she remembered. She quickly clapped her hand over the other girl's mouth, stifling the scream that was gurgling up Nima's throat. "M'dongo will protect us," Halima thought. She turned toward the warrior. To her amazement, she saw that M'dongo was cupping his hands in front of his mouth. He blew through his hands again, making the sound of the python, and followed it by hissing through his teeth in a perfect imitation of a viper. He was the one making the sound. The warriors danced away from the sound, shouting at each other in confusion. Halima looked at M'dongo and smiled at his cunning. "Well done, faithful protector," she whispered. He grinned shyly in response. M'dongo pointed to some thick bushes in the distance. "The Nikia," he whispered. Sliding to his belly, he slithered off, truly snake-like indeed. Halima lay down and crawled after him, and Nima anxiously followed at Halima's heels. The voices of the warriors grew fainter and fainter as they crawled toward the thick bush. They crawled for hundreds of yards under the Niika, sharp, thorny bushes that were impassable except on hands and knees. Halima could feel the sharp claws of the Niika raking against her back, tearing away at her pretty robes. Yet Halima was surprised to feel a guilty rush of excitement, as if they were embarking on a grand adventure. "This is the first time in my life that something has really happened to me," she thought. After 3 hours of uncomfortable crawling, they broke out from under the thorny bush and into a sparse forest. They scrambled to their feet. Nima bent over like an old woman, holding her back. "This is the most horrible day of my life," she exclaimed. "All that blood. I think I'm going to... She leaned over and began to retch. Halima, panting, leaned back against a tree, exhausted. "Are we safe here?" she demanded. M'dongo glanced around, getting his bearing. In the distance, a column of black smoke rose from the burning caravan. "No, Princess, we must go farther." That night, the 3 sat on the limb of a baobab tree, as thick around as a dozen grown men, far out of reach of the animals of the forest. All around them, a chorus of unfamiliar birds, lizards, and insects sang. Halima shivered. "Can't we build a fire? That would warm us and keep the beasts of the wild away as well." M'dongo shook his head. We are still too close to our enemies. Halima nodded. Somewhere a hyena cackled. Nima jumped at the sound, almost tumbling out of the tree. I hate this jungle, she spat. Do not call the forest that shelters you a jungle, the proverb says, Madongo cautioned her. Halima couldn't banish from her mind the picture of her handmaidens, her only friends, being plucked from the carriage like ripe fruit. She didn't even want to imagine what had become of them. My poor handmaidens, Halima exclaimed. Will I never see them again, loyal Madongo? The warrior rested his broad hands reassuringly on her shoulder. They will not be mistreated. Any woman taken by the Zimbai in such a raid becomes a daughter to the warrior who captured her, and it is taboo for him to molest her. He must clothe her, feed her, and take care of her just as any father would, until he finds her a husband. Each of your handmaidens will find a good husband among the Zimbai. Nima snorted. I would sooner lie down with a baboon than be soiled by the touch of a Zimbai. She shifted uncomfortably on the hard tree limb. Halima and Madongo exchanged smiles at the jittery servant girl's burst of bravado. What now, Madongo? Halima asked. Well, Your Highness, he replied, if we retrace our steps along the track to the caravan, we should be back in Kali in a week. Halima nodded thoughtfully, then asked, and if we go on to the land of the people of the snake? Madongo's eyes widened, and Nima's jaw dropped. Princess Halima, cried Nima, you can't mean us to go through this foul enemy land with all kinds of savage beasts around. And besides, your bridegroom is probably dead. The Zimbai probably caught him and cut off his stinking yellow hide. And if he's not dead, he's already proved himself a worthless coward. Halima gave her a warning look. I'm sworn to marry King Alagbadi, and upon that marriage depends the safety of our kingdom, she said sternly. She turned to Madongo. What do you say, faithful protector? Madongo looked at her solemnly. Then he told her, You are at a crossroad, princess. I will be your guard on any path you take, but only you can choose the direction. Halima sighed, thinking that was so helpful. She looked up at the star-filled sky. This reminds me of a story our griot, old Mordempoli, used to tell us, she said. Madongo looked at her puzzled, then cracked a smile. I think I know the one you mean, the story of Jabari and Bolade. Halima nodded. I don't know that one. Sing it, Halima, Nima beseeched, perking up. We're trying to hide, child, Halima reminded her. Sing it softly, then. It would make me feel so at home to hear you sing again, Nima pleaded. Halima turned to Madongo, who bobbed his head in approval. All right, then, Halima began. Bolade was a princess of a small, slender people of the north. She was beautiful as a rose, but haughty and vain like a peacock. She beat her servants like dogs and turned up her nose at every suitor who asked for her hand in marriage, because she believed they were too ugly. But one day, a terrible famine came into the land. The people were starving and would soon die. In desperation, Balade's father sent a message to the Snake King, whose land was always fertile. He offered gold, he offered silver, he offered land, he offered slaves, he offered everything he had for a few cattle and some grain to feed his people. The Snake King sent back word, agreeing to send food. All he wanted in return was the most beautiful maiden in the land, and that was Princess Bolade. That is the price the Snake King demanded. Balade's father agreed, because that was the only way he could save his people. He sent Bolade, along with wedding gifts and servants, on the path through the forest to the land of the Snake King. But along the way they were set upon by bandits, who robbed them of everything but the clothes on their backs. They killed all her servants, all who were supposed to protect her, except for one brave boy named Jabari. So they went on together, Bolade and Jabari, the princess and her servant. Together they wandered the desert and across the plain and through the forest.
Together they crossed rivers, hills, and valleys. Along the way, brave Jabari saved Baladi's life 12 times, once from a lion, once from a snake, once from drowning, once from a crocodile. And each time he saved her, she came to love him a little more, and he tamed a little of her haughtiness. But finally, they arrived at the land of the people of the snake, where Baladi was to be married to the Snake King. "But he loves Jabari," Nima protested. "But her duty is to marry the Snake King," Halima reminded her patiently. "It's the only way she can save her father's people." The people blindfolded Baladi and took her to a great lake. They pointed to a great rock in the center of the lake, and they told her, "That is where you will marry the king of the snakes." For you see, the Snake King was a great serpent that lived at the bottom of the lake, and he demanded one virgin girl, the most beautiful in the land, to be left for him each year in exchange for keeping the land surrounding the lake fertile. The people rowed Baladi to the rock and chained her there weeping. When Jabari saw what the people had done, he took a spear and dove into the lake. He swam to the bottom, and there he saw a serpent with a head the size of an elephant and a tail that stretched a mile long. For an hour, Jabari wrestled the horrible monster until he was out of breath, and he swam up for air. And again he dove down and battled the lake serpent. Finally, he slew the Snake King and cut off his head. He came ashore carrying the Snake King's head, and when the people realized that he alone among men had the courage to defeat their overlord, they made him their king. He promptly married Baladi and made her his queen. Together they ruled their new kingdom, but because the magic of the Snake King had been broken, the lake dried up forever. "And that is why there is drought," Halima finished. "That's a beautiful story," Nima sighed. She scratched her head. "But how did Baladi's land get a famine to begin with if there wasn't drought yet?" "It's only a fairy tale," Halima reminded her.
"And yet they say there is many a truth told in a tale, Princess," M'Dongo said meaningfully. She smiled wryly and looked at him for a moment. Then she made her decision.
"I think we will spare ourselves a long journey, and you, M'Dongo, we will spare from a heroic dive to the bottom of any lake. We will not go on to the land of the people of the snake. Tomorrow we will go home." "Praise the Great One in the sky!" Nima exclaimed.
"We'll need to rest then," M'Dongo said. "We should move out at first light, Princess." They made ready for sleep, huddling together for warmth. M'Dongo sat bracing himself against the tree trunk, his broad back flat against it. Halima sat between his knees, leaning against him, and Nima huddled in her lap. Encircled by the big man's long limbs, Halima felt protected as a child. No man since her father could make her feel this safe. The long day's hardship had exhausted her, made her almost giddy with sleepiness. She wondered, would he dare entertain fantasies of his princess? He couldn't. And yet, hadn't Jabari lain with Baladi like this, the servant with his princess, up in the treetops among the stars? And with those girlish thoughts, she slowly drifted off to sleep. They trekked back along the dusty trail that the caravan had made. Though they began early, they soon were sweltering under the merciless red sun. M'Dongo let both girls take a sip from his gourd each hour that they walked, to replace the rivers of sweat that poured off them. "Take some for yourself," Halima insisted. M'Dongo shook his gleaming bald head. "No, we passed a waterhole as we came this way. I remember. It isn't far." He strode ahead and the girls hurried after him. Halima soon felt her legs going wobbly under her. She was not used to long walks. All that saved her from keeling over was her youth. "This path seemed a lot shorter and cooler when we were being borne in a carriage," she thought. It had been a full day since she had eaten, and she was growing faint from hunger. Soon they came upon one of the huge termite mounds Halima had noticed on their outbound journey. She marveled at the tiny creatures and their architectural skill. It seemed to rival, in miniature, the handiwork of a temple builder of Kali. M'Dango burrowed eagerly into the mound with his spear, and after poking around for several moments, brought up a fist-sized ball of wriggling white larvae. He set it on a stone and used his knife to grind the creatures into soft white goo. He tasted it from the tip of his blade and then offered it to each of the girls. It turned out to be delicious, gummy, a bit like honey but not as sweet. Halima held her nose and reluctantly swallowed a bite of the food, then hungrily gobbled down all that remained. "We should dig the whole thing out and have ourselves a dinner," Nima said, licking the gooey food from her lips and fingers. M'Dango smiled and shook his head. "We've passed this way twice already. Let's leave some in case we pass again." A few hours later, they arrived at the waterhole. Halima tumbled to her knees with Nima just beside her, both nearly fainting. M'Dango raced to the waterhole and threw himself face down, lapping at the water like a wild dog. Then he scooped up water in his gourd, filling it to the brim, and trotted back to the two girls. Halima sucked down the cool, clear water, half emptying the gourd in one tremendous gulp, and passed it to her servant. Nima threw back her head and drained the gourd, splashing half of it on her bosom. M'Dango stopped her. "Not too much. You'll choke." The three of them collapsed flat on their backs. What a relief! Halima had been starting to think they would die of thirst. After a few moments' rest, M'Dango struggled to his feet, picked up his spear, and announced he was going to try to spear some fish. He pulled off his robe, and wearing only his loincloth, waded into the waterhole. Out of the corner of her eye, Halima watched as her broad-shouldered bodyguard stood knee-deep in water, feet planted wide apart like two stout trees. He held the tip of his spear poised above the pond, ready to strike, and hunched squinting at the glimmering water, as attentive as a falcon. His broad back was to Halima, black and shining with sweat, muscles rippling. She felt the blood rush to her cheeks, and a girlish titter tickled her throat. Halima whispered to her maidservant, "Nima, what do you think of him?" "Who?" "M'Dango, fool." Nima turned up her nose. "He's a bit rough, I think, like all his side of our family. I know he likes me, though." Halima raised her eyebrows. "You?" "Yes, he steals me a glance when he thinks I'm not looking. I expect he will ask your permission to court me soon." Halima frowned. "Well, I certainly wouldn't give it." Nima looked at her in surprise. "You want to marry up, don't you?" Halima demanded. "In Kali, I will find you a rich, fat old man who will give your daughter's land and your son's cattle." Nima smirked. "Thank you for your generosity, princess." Nima climbed her feet. "I'm going for a swim." She unfastened her now ragged robe and dropped it, then strutted toward the water in her loincloth, swiveling her hips impudently and jangling her many bracelets. Nima waded into the water beside M'Dango, who still stood in precisely the same position, frozen like a statue. He ignored her entirely, Halima noted much to her satisfaction, his eagle eyes fixed on the water. "What does she think she's doing?" the princess wanted to know. Nima bent over, scooped up 2 handfuls of water, and splashed her underarms. "Brazen, cheeky little trollop," Halima whispered to herself. For some reason she felt an unfamiliar twinge of anger welling. "Don't scare off the fish," M'Dango warned Nima stiffly, without turning his head. Standing behind him, Nima cupped her hands in the water and poured the contents over M'Dango's bald head. He was so startled, he yelped and fell back, spilling into the water. Nima burst into robust laughter. M'Dango scrambled to his feet, grabbed hold of her, and shook her. "You silly child, stop playing games. We need food to eat. I need fish to catch." Nima stuck out her tongue at him like a little girl. M'Dango scooped the buxom teen into the air and dumped her into the water. Nima gurgled under the water, flailing her arms. M'Dango roared with laughter as the girl spluttered and sat up. "That's what I needed. Bait," he chuckled. Halima called out to him, "M'Dango, when you get through with your horseplay, I'd like not to starve today." He looked up guiltily at Halima, as if only now remembering her presence. Yes, Your Highness, he said, bowing solemnly. By the end of the day, M'Dango had caught 5 long silvery fish, which he roasted for them on a stick over a small, comforting fire. Before they left the spot, M'Dango dug several traps beside the waterhole. He pointed out tiny tracks in the mud, explaining that many kinds of animals used the waterhole, and they would soon return to drink from it. Even though the pond would still stink of man a day from now, animals would risk approaching it. The next day they marched on across the veldt, continuing to follow the tracks of the caravan. Halima looked into the distance at the silver mountain, the mountain of mystery, with its halo of white at its peak. Are those really spirits at the mountain peak, she wondered, and giants truly inhabit those hills? She recalled what M'Dango had told her on the caravan. There are forests where men live who are no taller than children. In caves in the north there are men whose skins are white. Who can declare there is no race of giants? Again she felt a strange sensation that the mountain was beckoning her. They reached a ravine, a drop of some 50 feet. At the bottom, a meager trickle of water ran between the jagged rocks. Eons ago, a giant river must have run through here, down from the Silver Mountain, but had long ago been dried up. I must have been sleeping when we passed this way before, thought Halima. A slender, natural bridge of rock, no more than a dozen feet wide, was the only way across the ravine. Before making the crossing, they stopped to rest. Nima tore some parched leaves from a dead tree and disappeared behind a dry, stony bush. That usually signaled a long absence, Halima knew from experience. M'Dango squatted down and began setting a handful of stones about in a circle in which to build a fire. Halima knelt beside him, smiling at his efficiency. Quietly she told him, "You are very much like Jabari in the fairy tale." M'Dango looked up at her, his dark eyes strangely sad. "That was a fairy tale, princess," he replied. "And yet you said there was much truth sometimes in fairy tales," she said, looking at him intently. He shook his head solemnly. "A princess does not marry a servant. That does not happen." He hesitated, then added, "Even her father's sword-bearer." Halima felt the blood rushing to her cheeks. She bowed her head. M'Dango went on, "There is an order to things, princess. Those who oppose that order are usually destroyed." Halima felt her heart pounding. Order, order, order. She was supposed to be a princess, but she was a slave to order. First order declared she must marry a coward. Now it declares she could not have a true man. "Fine," she said coldly. "But you cannot have Nima. I forbid you to look at her or speak to her on our journey." His eyes betrayed dismay, but he spoke calmly. "As you wish, princess." He stood. "But remember, there are some things you cannot command." Halima felt herself trembling with fury. Nima appeared from behind the boulder, pouting. "These leaves are rough as sand," she complained. She stopped in her tracks and looked at the two, who were facing each other in stony silence. "I'm going back to the waterhole to check my traps. I'll be back by dusk." He turned and jogged off in the direction from which they came. Halima and Nima eyed each other warily. The orange sun hung low in the sky, and M'Dango had not yet returned from the waterhole. Halima ordered her servant to hunt for firewood. It was steaming hot now, and flies the size of hummingbirds flitted about their hair and eyes, but it would be cold come nightfall. Halima gathered wood, too. She knew Nima was too lazy to gather all that they needed. She bent again and again for the sticks, annoyed that she was reduced to the work of a common servant. For as long as M'Dango has been absent, you better bring back a plump, juicy hare, she thought. I've never before built up such an appetite. This outdoor life is turning me into a different person altogether. After collecting a staggering armload of large dry sticks, she let them tumble into the middle of the circle of stones M'Dango had made, and then stood stroking her worn shoulders. I'll be happy when we get home to Kali, she thought, and others will take care of this type of brute labor. She heard gentle singing and looked up to see Nima approaching, holding a single greenish branch. Halima could not believe how stupid she was. "That won't burn," she shouted. She ripped it from Nima's hand and broke it. "I declare, you must have cow blood in you. I've never seen a woman with so little sense." Nima bowed her head, humiliated. Then she murmured, almost inaudibly, "He prefers me, you know." Halima turned on her. "What's that?" she demanded. Nima met her eyes defiantly. "I said he prefers me." Halima scowled. She could not believe how insolent her servant was becoming, as if Halima were some village girl who had to squabble over the prettiest boy of the town. "If he prefers you," Halima said angrily, "it is because you give off the scent of availability, like a she-cat of the jungle. When you were brought to the palace as a little girl from your pitiful fishing village, we thought we could make a lady of you, but I see we were wrong. A cat can live in the temple, but it's still a cat." Nima, turning purple, balled her fists and stepped up into Halima's face, so close their breasts nearly collided. "Princess, we're not in the palace now." "Don't you dare use that tone with me," Halima exclaimed. She shoved Nima away, and the girl stumbled back a few feet. To Halima's astonishment, the servant girl charged her and pushed her right back. Halima stumbled back, nearly tripping to the ground. This was an outrage. She grabbed a hold of Nima's meaty shoulders and hurled her back with all her might. Nima staggered back, arms swinging wildly, and she took one giant leap backward off the ravine. She screamed in terror. Halima rushed forward and snatched Nima's wrist. She yanked, using all her weight, and hauled Nima back from the precipice. They faced each other, exchanging looks of horror over the near tragedy. Halima embraced her servant in relief. "All this over a man," she whispered. Nima giggled. All of a sudden, a male voice chortled, and it didn't sound like Madongo. They turned in unison to see a pair of strange faces poking out of the brush. The two men stood up from the bushes. One carried a bow, the other a spear. The bowman was tall and slender, with large, long-lashed eyes. The bowman was tall and slender, with large, long-lashed eyes that gave him an almost girlish beauty. The spearman was short and stout, like a wild boar, with a heavy, furrowed brow. The bowman smiled and spoke in the hissing tongue of the people of the snake, King Alagbadi's people. "Mercenaries say that in the pleasure domes of the eastern world, women wrestle in pits for the entertainment of men. My kinsman and I thought you were going to give us a show like that." Nima slid behind her princess. The handsome one raised a hand in greeting. "We see you are preparing a fire. May we join you?" "I don't think so," Halima thought. She bowed her head and adopted a humble tone. "We cannot give you permission, brave warrior. Our husbands and brothers are hunting nearby. When they return, they would be angry if we invited strangers into our camp." The handsome one's pretty eyes narrowed, and he grinned. He set down his bow and arrows. "You're lying," he said. "We know that you are girls from the caravan and have no husbands. My kinsman and I were in the party guarding it." Nima pushed forward and pointed. "Look at their cheeks, Halima. They wear the brand of the deserter." As she said it, the squat one reflexively brought up his hand as if to shield his face. Halima saw that, indeed, each man's cheek bore a freshly carved single red X. It wasn't the carefully detailed tribal scarring she'd seen before. This had been done hastily and brutally. Nima spat. "They are cowards who fled from the battle on the veldt, branded and banished to wonder." The squat spearman bristled. The handsome bowman merely smiled coolly and said through clenched teeth, "Many ran from battle that day, and not all of them wear the brand of cowardice." Halima put her hands on her hips. "If you are warriors of the people of the snake, then you must take us to your ruler, King Alagbadi, at once," she commanded. The handsome deserter let out a harsh laugh. He turned to the squat one. "Do you hear that, cousin? They want us to take them to their king. What do you say to that, cousin?" The squat deserter spat a wad of saliva over the ravine. The handsome one stepped closer to Halima. "We are proud to be deserters. What use do we have for kings? We are proud to be deserters. What use do we have for kings? What did kings do for us but send us to war in foreign lands? What do kings do for us but make us shed our blood while griots praise them? Why should we lose arms and legs and make widows of our wives so that kings can sit on thrones of gold? Our king ran from battle like a frightened girl. We obey no king now. We are our own kings now. Nima let loose a contemptuous laugh. Yes, kings with no country. The handsome warrior looked more serious now. He strode up to Halima and took her arm urgently, then pointed to the Silver Mountain. You see the Silver Mountain? Yes, Halima answered, startled at his touch. Beyond the Silver Mountain, travelers say there's a greater mountain still, and in those mountains a great lake, a lake of lakes that is said to be the birthplace of all mankind. From that lake flows a river that runs into a valley and makes that valley more fertile than any land the world has ever known. That is the land we will settle. You two are mad, Nima laughed. The handsome deserter tightened his grip on Halima and stared at her, his black eyes flashing with strange desperation. There's no going back for us now. There's no home. We need wives to take with us. Come with us. Halima shook her head. We want you as our women, he insisted. Nima stepped forward and pulled Halima away from him. Begone, worm! You vermin aren't fit to stay in our sight, far less assault our ears with trash about marriage. The glow departed from the handsome deserter's eyes, and he stepped back sullenly. He drew out a glimmering dagger. Come with us as our wives, or be taken here and now like beasts of the wild. That is the choice we give you. Halima's heart began to pound. She stepped back and pointed to the turtle-shaped pendant around her neck. Mustering a voice of cool superiority, she warned, I am Halima, Princess of Kali. Dishonor me and the wrath of my father will rain down on you until you pray for death. The two men traded quick looks of surprise. The handsome deserter took a long step toward her. I've never lain with a princess. This may be the only chance I've got, he purred. But he stopped short, and there was a hint of cowardly indecision in his eyes. Nima put her hands on her plump hips and laughed derisively. You weaklings would never have the courage to defile my princess, she exclaimed. The handsome deserter turned on her. Then we'll take the servant. No, Halima cried. The handsome deserter gestured to the squat one, who bolted forward like a bull elephant and tackled Nima as she tried to run. He brought the screeching girl to the ground as easily as a cowherd, taking down a young heifer of her branding. Halima screamed in protest, and the handsome deserter grabbed hold of her. She squirmed, a hellcat in his grip, while she watched the squat one wrestle Nima to the ground and pin her. Halima looked on, frozen in horror, as the squat deserter shredded away Nima's bright robe, tearing it into strips. The serving girl let out a stream of ear-splitting shrieks and curses and pounded on his big drum of a chest with fists, all in vain. He reached between her legs with one big hand, yanked off her loincloth, and flung it into the ravine. Nima managed to wriggle onto her belly and slipped away, her long fingernails breaking as she scrabbled for purchase on the dry red earth. Before she got 2 feet, however, the squat deserter caught her again. Kneeling behind her, he scooted his big hands on her hips and hoisted her broad buttocks up into the air. Snorting like a wild boar about to charge, he prepared to mount her. You pig! Halima cried, her paralysis breaking. She tore away from the handsome deserter and picked up a piece of firewood. Damn, she thought. Unless I nail him with a death blow to the temple, he'll be able to take the weapon away from me as easily as a rattle from a baby. She brought down the stick on the handsome deserter with all her strength, but his hand caught her slender wrist in mid-air like a striking cobra pouncing on a too-slow mongoose. He twisted her arm behind her back and gently pulled the stick out of her hand. He tossed it away. How could I have thought those eyes pretty? They are as empty of pity as a snake's. Now I want to see how a princess makes love, he growled. Just then, Halima saw a shadow fall across his face. Halima turned to see M'Dango standing on a boulder with a young antelope draped over his shoulders and his spear upraised. "Thank the Great One in the sky!" The warrior's broad nostrils flared angrily as he took in the scene before him. The squat deserter stood up. M'Dango looked at the two young men with contempt. "Jackals, is this how the people of the Snake treat their women?" "We are outcasts," the handsome deserter replied. "No law binds us." M'Dango looked at the two young men with contempt. "Jackals, is this how the people of the Snake treat their women?" "We're outcasts," the handsome deserter replied. "No law binds us." M'Dango looked at Nima, crouched trembling at Halima's feet, shielding her womanhood. His voice trembled with rage. "Have you no mothers, or sisters, or daughters, that a woman's honor means so little to you?" The handsome deserter took a step closer to his bow, which lay a few feet away on the ground. He yelled back, "We gave them a chance. Be our wives, or lie with us like beasts of the wild." M'Dango let the antelope fall with a thud and jumped down from the boulder, kicking up red dust as he landed. "I will give you two a choice," he said solemnly. He held his spear aloft, poised to hurl it. He gestured to the ravine. "This is your choice. Jump into that ravine, or die at the point of my spear." The handsome deserter looked in confusion at his squat kinsman. M'Dango strode forward. "Choose, I say," he bellowed. The handsome deserter stepped back. "All right, then. The ravine," he said. Then he ducked down and made a quick as a cobra snatch for his bow. Fast as lightning, he had an arrow in place and was pulling back the bowstring. Halima screamed, "Watch out!" much too late. Before the deserter could let loose his arrow, M'Dango bounded toward him and buried his spear straight through his throat. Halima screamed as the spear point burst out of the back of the deserter's neck, and blood squirted across her robe. The squat deserter moved as quickly as his chunky frame would allow, and he retrieved his own spear from the ground. But by the time he bent forward, the contest was over. M'Dango had the handsome deserter's bow trained right between his eyes. M'Dango marched determinedly toward the squat deserter, backing him toward the ravine. The squat deserter looked around in desperation and saw he had no chance. He looked so pitiful, like a poor, trapped bull. Despite all his brutality, Halima cried out, "Mercy!" She could not stand to see another killing. But there was no mercy in M'Dango's eyes. Another second, and he would let loose the arrow right into the deserter's left eye. The squat deserter's heels reached the crevasse, and he momentarily lost his balance, swaying there for a moment. Then he spun, and roaring like a gored bull, leapt off across the ravine. With a running start he might have stood a chance, but leaping from a standing position, he bellowed in anguish all the way to the bottom of the ravine. When he hit, it was like a spoiled melon splattering. Nima was still crouched at Halima's feet, covering her face. Her body shook convulsively as she wept with shame. M'Dango rushed to her side. He rested a broad hand gently on her bare back, and she jumped as if she'd been touched by lightning. Halima shooed him away and knelt beside her handmaiden. Gently, she took Nima by the shoulders and raised her up so they knelt facing each other. Nima's face was covered with red dust and marked with tear stains. Halima took pieces from the girl's tattered dress and wiped away her tears, cleaned off her face, and tried to wipe her body. Nima snorted back her tears. "Leave me alone. It's nothing. I'm just a servant girl. This is my lot." Halima shook her head silently. Nima said listlessly, "You must beat me for pushing you, princess. I forgot my place for a moment. I forgot what I am." She bowed her head deeply in bitter defeat. "No!" cried Halima. She stood up and yanked Nima to her feet. She pulled off her own robe and wrapped it around Nima. Then she hurriedly began to pull off her jewelry, one piece at a time, and to carefully place them on Nima's arms and neck and ankles. She stripped herself of every priceless ring and bracelet, all except the sea turtle pendant, the symbol of the royal clan, which hung about her neck. All of it she used to adorn Nima.
Then she stared deeply in Nima's eyes. "From this day forward, gentle Nima," she said, "you are not my servant. You are my sister, my friend." She embraced the other girl. Nima hesitated, then hugged back, tentatively at first, then as hard as she could. M'Dongo grabbed the feet of the dead bowman and began to drag the corpse away. Halima turned to him, and they exchanged somber glances. M'Dongo gestured at the corpse.
"Without laws, we are nothing."
"What are you doing?" Halima demanded.
"I want to bury them before the sun goes down. The hyenas will be out soon."
Nima broke away from Halima and rushed over, her eyes full of angry tears. "Don't you dare bury them!" she screamed, and kicked the dead man's lolling head as if it were a ball. "Leave their stinking meat for the vultures."
But Dongo cautioned, "Princess, if we do not bury them, their restless spirits will haunt this ravine for eternity."
Halima frowned. She shuddered at the thought of the ghosts of these two rogues plaguing every traveler who passed this way for the next 10,000 years. "I'm sorry, Nima. We must bury them. Let's be quick." They buried the deserters side by side at the base of the ravine and said a few quick prayers to speed their journey to join their ancestors. The plan to follow the caravan tracks back home had hit a snag. If there were other deserters, many of them might be taking the same route to escape to Calais. There was still the roaming band of Zimbai, too. They decided the safest course was a detour skirting through the foothills of the Silver Mountain, where few traveled out of fear of the legendary giants of the mountain. They planned to set out at first light the next day. That night, dancing before the fire, M'Dongo used the entrails of the antelope in a ritual to cleanse himself of the killing of the two deserters, as well as the killings of the Zimbai warriors during the ambush. While singing prayers begging the Great One in the sky for forgiveness, he wrapped himself in the intestines of the slaughtered beast and then sliced them away. By doing so, he severed himself from the deaths he caused. At the end of the ritual, Halima felt a deep sense of harmony restored, and a new sense of peace fell over their camp. She sat beside the fire, under the blanket of stars, watching her two companions, who knelt facing each other. They were silent, but between them passed something that went beyond words. After a moment, Nima and M'Dongo both began to quietly cry. Although Halima sensed the sudden bond between them, for the first time she did not feel an uncontrollable outburst of jealousy. Somehow she understood that this is how it must be. She suddenly felt as if she were alone on the vast plain. "I've never felt more lonely than this," she thought. "Someday there will be a man for you," she told herself, "but this is not the man, and this is not the day." Tears welling up in her eyes, she looked off to the Silver Mountain, its white peak glimmering faintly in the moonlight. And as she gazed at it, a tingle of excitement rushed over her like a quick night breeze.